So today I am going to talk about appraisal responses and different ways to not only respond, but what to do in situations where you might have an appraisal come in, maybe either lower than value or at value with conditions. So the two main forms that we're going to talk about are going to be the new form for the work order, which is the AWO, and the notice of low appraisal form, the 22AN. So what happens when an appraisal doesn't come in at value? What happens if it does, but there are work orders called out, and whose responsibility is it to complete those? Like I said, in our slides coming up, we will be talking about those responses using the 22AWO and AN and getting familiar with the forms. We will also be looking at response times for buyers and sellers and discussing possible outcomes for the way you choose to respond. All right, you've had an appraisal. The appraisals come back. So unless it's come back at value with no conditions or work orders, you still have some work to do to get the transaction closed. This is usually the part where you need your good cooperation and communication skills. So let's talk about the next steps. If you have a buyer who has an appraisal that comes in low, what would you typically do? And how about if that was a seller? How would you react as buyer and seller? Their first step, if you're truly going to negotiate any part of this low appraisal, you're going to have to turn in this notice of low appraisal. You're going to have to do this too within 3 days of receiving that low appraisal. It's not an indefinite timeline. You have to do this within those 3 days. This is literally just a checkbox to let the seller know that the appraisal has come in low. And what happens next is going to be in the seller's court. So the seller is going to be able to decide how they want to respond to this low appraisal. Don't forget to attach the appraisal to this form when you turn it in. And once you turn it in, the seller has this list of choices. We've seen this before, not only in this form, but also in the 22A. So those paragraphs that we talk about, probably skimming them over, are the exact paragraphs that correspond with these notices. If you remember in the 22A, there are timelines set in there, there are response options, and we usually give our buyers a little bit of a roadmap of how that looks. Once you give notice of low appraisal, the seller can do any one of these 4 things. Make sure when you use this form to continually communicate what the responses are and those responses to the responses. So similarly to like a 35R. Once the seller receives this notice, they have 10 days to decide how they're going to make this work. Okay, they can give the notice of reconsideration. That just means they want a new appraisal done where they can give better comps and potentially make that value match up to the sales price. This part is a process. You need to start this immediately. And once it's done, if it does come up in value, it still needs to be approved by the bank. So the bank still is the final say, but it has been successful with some of our agents to have a reconsideration by providing comps, by basically talking to that appraiser and arguing your point here. The seller can consent to reduce the purchase price. They can reduce it to the amount of the appraisal. There can be a negotiation of anything in between. Keep in mind, if they do negotiate it above an appraisal price, the VA, I believe FHA has an amendatory clause that does not tie that buyer to that decision. They can say no and still get out with a contingency. Or the seller can just look at it and say, you know what, I'm not willing to sell it below this much money. Buyer, sorry, I'm not reducing the price. It's this or nothing. They're going to check it on that box. And then the buyer is going to have 3 days to respond to whatever that decision was. These timelines seem like they may be kind of being pulled out of the air, but they're not. They're actually written in detail, like I said, again, on 22A. So this form should be used in conjunction with 22A. The buyer can decide they want to walk away. They can move forward with bringing extra money to the table. They can accept a reduction of the purchase price. So, I mean, the buyer has the final say at this point. So once the seller has responded, buyer has 3 days to decide if they are going to accept what they have to say and move forward, or if they're going to go ahead and walk away. But those basic options are in these 4. And this right here is from 22A, so you can see where the timelines came from. It's in section C of the buyer's reply for the appraisal. Keep in mind too, if you are using a financing contingency, the buyer can waive the financing contingency, but retain the appraisal provision. So this would cover the buyer under that appraisal provision, whether the financing is waived or not, as long as they had it still. Unless they completely waive appraisal, the buyer has the right to respond to a low appraisal or one with work orders. That's actually different from what it used to be in the past. If there were work orders, but it came in at value, the buyer would basically be stuck purchasing the house or defaulting. So appraisal with work order conditions. These are the work orders right here. It's just a notice. You'll want to attach the copy of the work order to this. It's just this right here. Now, there is nothing that spells out who's responsible for doing things and consequences for not doing anything. So the way this works is the buyer has the protection of the appraisal provision. That includes the work orders. If the work orders can't be negotiated before closing, they still have the protection of the appraisal provision. So if it does not close because of this, the buyer gets to walk away with their earnest money. Anytime you're dealing with work orders, you're going to have to step outside the box, contact the agent, and see if you can come to some sort of an agreement. Now, there is no in between. The work orders have to be fully completed in order to have the transaction close. The bank does not accept partial work orders being done. Did you have a question you wanted to pop in and ask?
Yeah, I was just going to ask about like what the timeline would look like for that. So we just got the appraisal report back. It wasn't low, but we need to fix something in order for it to meet that. Mm-hmm. So I have the report from the appraisal report from my lender. Should I then email that report, simultaneously send this to my buyer, or how does that, how does this work?
Yeah. So who do you represent in this?
I'm representing the buyer. Sorry.
Okay. So as a buyer, you can talk to as a buyer's agent, you can talk to your buyer and say, okay, here's a list of things that need to be complete. Now, depending on their type of loan, they may have to remain completely hands-off on this. I don't know what type of loan you're working with, but sometimes with certain buyers, certain types of lending, they will not allow that buyer to help out in any way before closing. So
they're just conventional.
Okay, so if your buyer wants to ask that seller to take care of these things, because that's the only way this is going to close, you can attach that work order to this form and send it to that seller. Now, I don't remember seeing a timeline for this, but the timeline for everything else in submission is 3 days. So if there's work orders that need to be done, I would probably submit sooner than later for this. This doesn't obligate either person to do it. It's a notice. So it really doesn't put into action anything. It just gives the notice of these things needing to be done. But because that notice is given, that seller now will know that you cannot close and have protection of your financing contingency if this doesn't get negotiated.
Okay, so that should likely be the first thing that I do as soon as I get this, or as soon as I get a lower the appraisal back that says we need to get this work done.
Yeah, so if you're going to ask that seller, put this in immediately, I would say, with the list of work orders. I don't believe they need the entire appraisal for this. I think they just need the work order. So you can remove all the other pages, attach only the work order page, and give them the notice that these work orders have been called out by the appraiser.
Okay.
There is no timeline for completion of this or anything else either. So this is, in the past, what we would have done is phone call back and forth. Hey, seller, you need to complete, you need to fix the deck railing before the lender's going to go ahead and close on this. And then it would be a conversation of, does the seller have to do it? Well, not really, but if you want to close it, it might be the only way that works. I've had in the past where the seller gave permission for the buyer to come over and screw a couple things into the deck, and that was good enough. In most cases, it's usually worked out, and the work order is done at the bare minimum needed to go ahead and close. What they've changed in this is, in the past, if it came in at value and you've waived financing and the appraisal, it technically came in at value, whether there's work orders or not. So buyers were stuck in this situation where, wow, I've waived my financing. I don't have my appraisal provision because it came in at value. But now all these things are conditioned on this work getting done that are completely out of my hands. And being out of your hands like that left the buyers in an unfair situation where they would be at the mercy of the seller wanting this to close and not wanting just to take their earnest money and walk away. So this just gives us a way to talk about those things. And it gives the seller notice that, hey, buyer has protections under their financing. And if this doesn't get complete, we won't close, and you're not going to get the buyer's earnest money. Does that answer the question?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it does.
Okay. So just make sure too, if you're using any response for an appraisal, that you have an appraisal provision to use it for. Seems pretty obvious. I think everybody here does it already, but unless you're using a 22A or the appraisal addendum, the AA, you can't make a response to something you never had a protection or a contingency for in the first place. So the 22AWO is to be used along with the financing contingency or the 22AA, which is the appraisal contingency. There is a clause in the financing. Again, I'm referencing the 22A here with this paragraph D that spells out what happens if these work orders can't be negotiated or completed. It has a clause
as long as we have a 22A, we're protected with this, right? But if we don't have a 22A, then it's kind of.
Then why are you turning it in, right?
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. So the whole idea is this appraisal is the final approval for the bank for financing contingencies. So even if the financing is waived, you have the appraisal provision. I haven't yet been able to figure out how to put a contract together where financing is a contingency, but they want to waive appraisal. I still can't get that to work because they coexist. You can't have the appraisal taken away, but the protection of financing, because the financing is 100% dependent on that appraisal. So these do work hand in hand. But it also means since the addition of this form, that work can be negotiated. And if it's not complete, it is not the burden of the buyer. It is the burden of the seller. So indirectly, it is technically the seller's responsibility as the final straw if they want it to close. But technically, it is not an obligation for either person to do. I just attached right here, paragraph D, that added the work order. And it says, if buyer is unable to obtain financing by closing due to the incomplete appraisal work, then on buyer's notice, this agreement shall terminate. And if buyer has not waived paragraph 5, the earnest money shall be refunded to the buyer after providing the lender confirmation in compliance with paragraph 4. So that's just proving good faith application. They applied on time, the normal things to retain earnest money for your financing contingency. So these do work hand in hand. Okay, so I have some fun situational questions. The appraisal came in $2,500 low. Would you send a notice of low appraisal? And then why or why not?
I think it depends. Like if the buyer says, yes, we send it, then we send it. But I think in most cases, the buyer would come up with the difference.
Yeah. So with that amount being so low, you would definitely want to have a conversation with your buyer, because once you send the notice of low appraisal and the seller consents to lowering the price and moving forward, you've waived the rest of your financing. You're moving on. You're closing no matter what. So if that's an easy number for your client to still retain their financing, then you may consider not giving notice.
Yeah.
Would you fight for a reappraisal if it came in low?
I have. I have in the past. There's been times that I have and times that I haven't. Sometimes the appraisers are unwilling to budge. There are certain ones I know if they came in low, it wouldn't matter if I went back to them or not.
Yeah, actually.
Makes sense.
Yep, I think I know exactly who you're talking about too.
Yeah. So, because we deal with a lot of the same appraisers, but if I get an appraiser that's coming from out of area and I talk to them first and I know that they don't work in this area, I will provide them information to help them with their appraisal, or I'll meet them at the house.
Is that something that you regularly do? You meet them at the house with comps or talk on the phone? I mean, how do you prepare your appraisers?
If the house is occupied, it's really easy for me to meet them at the house. I typically do meet them. But if it's vacant, then they're kind of evasive. So I will leave them on the counter with like some water and just a thank you note for coming out. I'll also talk to them on the phone and see if they know the area or not. Like I had one, he did not know the area at all. So he was like, yeah, whatever information you can give me would be super helpful because there were no comps for this property. And so he really appreciated my help in giving him information. So I always try to, whether they take the comps or not, they may not, but at least they see what I leave.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Or I'll point out, like, that's where our marketing comes in handy too, because I'll make sure that like I still have all of my upgrades lists and feature boards out, because they will look at those things. And so it gives them an idea also of
Yeah,
what the upgrades are.
that's actually a really good idea. And our features list, I think, is what, $13.
Yeah.
So what a great way to like, I'm not
Passively.
really telling you how to appraise this house, but at the same time, like, if you would just take a great look at this list right here,
Yeah.
let me give
Anything
you
that,
a cookie also.
and I do a lot of research too. My area is narrower. So but I can speak to them about, this is a comp that I used. These are the concessions that were used for it. I talked to the agent and this is what they said.
Yeah.
So I can speak to those things, and I always make sure I let them know that we had more than one offer, where they came in at, because all of those things play a very big role in how they appraise it.
Yeah, and I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, or if maybe I've just been super lucky. But over 2021 and 2022, the appraisers would call me. I would have a really good conversation with them. And then I would end up sending them the front page of all my offers I got, so they could see everybody coming in at around the same price, or they could see where it was escalated. I had one that was listed at $499 because I was genuinely concerned it wouldn't appraise over 510. And we had offers escalating all the way up to 675. We ended up at 655 because of escalation clauses. But in order to justify that price, the appraiser asked me to send him the top, they said the top 3. I sent him the top 5 offers that escalated to where we were. And that it appraised.
Yeah. I think having the conversations and giving them that data is really, really helpful. I don't ever want my houses to come in appraising low. That's really hard as a listing agent to have that conversation, like, oh, now we got to lower a price. So I try to avoid those conversations whenever possible.
Yeah. And this is also really important, like when you're pricing things, as well as when you're putting offers on something. Knowing as a listing agent, if the offer comes in on the higher side, asking for that additional down payment, so you don't have to have those conversations. They're super awesome.
Yeah, because you can escalate all you want on something. If there's no
offer you $1 million on that $400,000 house.
Because we were seeing that a lot in 2021, 2021. It was like, oh, we're just going to escalate X amount of dollars over, but there's no 22AD. We would pick people with 22ADs with a lower price because it gave us better protection. It gave my sellers better protection, and knowing that if it did appraise for lower, we had some protection in it.
Yeah. I had offers that were, that shiny dangly carrot of offering 800,000, which is, 200 to 300 over list price. But everybody there knew that we were just at the mercy of whatever the appraisal came in, so it really didn't matter. So I don't know if that was a tactic people were using in 2021, or if that was just them truly trying to win the list, or trying to win it. Okay, so here's a really odd one that I came across, and it was actually a brand new legal hotline question. I just thought it was a really important way to think about this. So if the buyer waives financing due to the buyer in this situation waived financing due to changing their loan type without the broker's knowledge. Their own broker did not know they changed their loan type. So they had applied for conventional, then changed it to FHA without permission. The appraisal comes in low. So the buyer broker, thinking that they have the protection of the appraisal, submits a 22AN when in fact they actually don't have any protections at all. The seller knows that they've waived this and now needs to figure out how they want to respond, knowing that this appraisal is low. So in that weird situation, does the seller have to cooperate? And should the seller cooperate?
Do they have to? No. Should
No,
they?
don't have to.
I mean,
So this is really like, if you think about this, it's the same exact thing as not having an inspection contingency, but asking for a repair.
yeah,
So they don't have to do anything, right? The seller doesn't have to respond on this. In fact, if they use a 22AN and the seller does respond, that's going to just create a whole lot of confusion. So think about this as there's no contingency. Why are you sending me a response for a contingency you don't have?
yeah,
In this case, if the seller does want to cooperate, because now they're on notice, they know whether that's truly on notice or not, they know now it's not going to appraise. The buyer is still financing, so the deal is going to fall apart unless something happens. So should the seller cooperate? I don't know. It depends on how much they actually want to close this. And if they do choose to cooperate, how would they cooperate if you don't want to use a contingency response for a contingency you don't have?
I would try to keep it together. That's obviously it's the seller's choice on what they want to do, but if there's not a backup buyer sitting in the wings and you've already been on the market for a little bit, it's probably in the seller's best interest to work something out to
Yeah, I 100%
get the
agree.
transaction closed.
Yeah. So the best way to do this without having to create some unintentional consequences is just to use a 34. This is one of those times that they always say, don't use the blank form unless you absolutely have to. This is an absolutely have to. So if you want to work this out without having that whole response time, because remember the 22AN gives buyers the chance to respond, sellers the chance to respond, go back and forth. You can come up with an agreement and just put it on a blank form 34. Okay. I'm going to stop the screen share, but if anybody else has any weird situations that they've gone through that they would like to share, I am definitely interested in hearing them.